Ever been robbed by a one-armed bandit or found yourself holding a dead man's hand? Well, place your bets and take a chance to find out. This is what gambling was like in the Wild West. Gambling began as a way to battle boredom on the various riverboats cruising around the eastern United States. The first official casino, Crescent City House, opened in New Orleans in 1827. By 1849, games of chance had made their way west, where San Francisco became a gambling mecca. Between 1850 and 1910, wagering became all the rage as a popular form of entertainment. As gambling joints reaped more and more profits, their owners were able to upgrade their primitive businesses from simple tents and shacks to grand lounges. In Tombstone, Arizona, for example, there were some 18 gambling halls by 1881, including the lavishly decorated Birdcage Theater. By then, just about every town across the West offered betting games in some form or another. There were even some professional gamblers, although they were nothing like today's pros who hide behind sunglasses, hats, and other distractions. Card games were some of the earliest forms of gambling in the West. One of the earliest and most popular was 21, the French name for today's 21 or blackjack. The gameplay was fairly similar, as a player vied for cards totaling 21 without going over. Beginning in 1825, Faro, also with French origins, became another popular card game. The dealer dealt two cards. The first was the loser, the second the winner, and the players bet which would be which until all the cards had been dealt. Although Faro was the most popular card game in the West, there was also Monte, which was played in a variety of ways, although today 3-card Monte is now seen as nothing more than a swindle. And then there's poker, which also originated in New Orleans. Back then, it was much the same as it is today, with a few exceptions. Only face cards and tens were used, and players were dealt all of the cards with no draw. Draw poker, meanwhile, used all 52 cards and was known as jackpots. A predecessor of today's craps, Hazard consisted of a player rolling 2 dice while calling out a number between 5 and 9. Roll the number and win. Roll 2 or 3 and lose. But if a player got a 6, 8, 11, or 12 on subsequent rolls, they could win or lose depending on the winning number. Players had 3 chances to lose before the dice passed to the next player. Chuck-a-Luck was another popular game, and it had lower stakes for gamblers with less money. 3 dice were placed in a small special cage, and bettors waged which number die would roll out, as well as 2 of a kind and 3 of a kind. Those who couldn't afford the cage used a tin horn instead, hence the phrase tin horn gambler. And roulette was another French game that came west from New Orleans. American casinos didn't like the odds that the French version of the game gave players, so they added extra zeros and an eagle symbol, which denoted a house win. And Keno was pretty much the same as it is now, with players placing a bet on a certain set of numbers to be chosen by a drawing.
Man, have to be an idiot to play roulette. Do I look like an idiot? Do I?
No, sir.
And don't you forget it.
Long before the likes of baseball, basketball, and football dominated the American cultural landscape, gamblers bet on various other sporting events. The most gruesome of these were bull and bear fights, wherein the animals were pitted against each other. Cockfights and dogfights were also popular. Classier folks bet on human foot races, as well as horse and dog races, and competitions between miners in the gold rush towns or loggers and logging towns. Rifle matches were also quite popular. Then there was boxing, which reportedly dates back to plantation owners pitting enslaved people against each other. By the 1880s, the sport was more professional, though still illegal. Later, professional baseball, basketball, and football teams eventually also caught the eyes of gamblers. In time, what are known today as off-track betting parlors became popular, so wagers could be made via telegraph without having to travel to the event itself. The old one-armed bandit came on the betting scene fairly late in the Wild West era. According to Britannica, the term slot machine was short for nickel in the slot machine. The first of these debuted in America during the 1880s. They were initially novelties wherein a toy horse race or other entertaining event took place, and those betting on the winner got a cigar or cocktail on the house. The first actual poker machine appeared in 1891. Like its predecessors, winners received complimentary bar fare instead of cash. Not until the mid-1890s did Charles Fay, a mechanic in San Francisco, introduce an actual slot machine that rewarded players with money. Fay's Liberty Bell slot machine in 1894 and the Card Bell slot machine in 1898 both proved quite popular. Other manufacturers followed, and nowadays there are hundreds of different slots out there. Make no mistake, there's a reason why gamblers openly brought their guns to the table in the Wild West. It may be true that firearms had no place among the liquor-soaked losers who suspected a cheat, but that's the way it was in those days. Indeed, gaming houses were full of card sharks who knew all sorts of ways to part a gambler from his money. There were manufacturers of marked playing cards, and there were many other ways to cheat as well. One particular card manufacturer invented an array of delightful devices for cheats, including bags to attach to the underside of tables and contraptions for concealing cards on the body. Dealers sometimes dealt from the bottom of the deck, while players could secretly palm or skim the hand to play or discard cards of their choosing. Anyone who wanted to learn how to cheat could also consult the 1901 book The Expert at the Card Table. It was written by E.S. Andrews, but under a pen name that was his actual name spelled backwards. And throughout the 1800s, manufacturers also sold cheat dealing boxes, which were especially handy for houses wanting to increase their odds against the players. Jefferson Randolph Smith got his nickname Soapy from his first con during the 1870s. He would stand with a table of soap in front of him, cheerfully wrapping each bar with paper money followed by plain paper. Onlookers were told that each bar held money, as one of Smith's cohorts purchased one and found a $100 bill in it for all to see. Subsequent buyers, of course, found no money with their soap. Smith also loved games of chance, reportedly once announcing, "I am no ordinary gambler. The ordinary gambler hazards his own money in an attempt to win another's. When I stake money, it is a sure thing that I win." Using cheating devices and other forms of deceit, Smith wrangled enough ill-gotten cash to make his way to Skagway, Alaska in 1897. But his lack of scruples angered the townsfolk, who reportedly formed a committee to catch swindlers like him. In turn, Smith formed his own group. That didn't go over well with the others, who were discussing how to proceed when Smith crashed their party in 1898. Engineer Frank H. Reed battled it out with Smith, shooting and killing him on July 8th of that year. Among the most famous gamblers in the West, Wild Bill Hickok, Doc Holliday, and Bat Masterson are just a few of the names that you're probably already familiar with. Hickok was a Civil War veteran known for numerous gunfights. When he was shot to death in a Deadwood casino in 1876, the poker hand he was holding included 2 aces and 2 eights, and henceforth became known as a dead man's hand. Masterson, a former buffalo hunter, reportedly used his winnings to promote prize fights and fund various passions before becoming a law-abiding sheriff. His buddy was the notorious Doc Holliday, who was also a professional gambler with a bad temper. And let's not forget their legendary friend Wyatt Earp, whose aggressive gambling style made him famous throughout the West. Lesser-known gamblers include Charles Cora, a New Orleans faro player who married his sex worker sweetheart and was accused of murder in San Francisco before being publicly hanged. Then there was Luke Short, who was known as the gunfighting gambler who honed his craft in Leadville, Colorado. And John Wesley Hardin was another famous gunfighter who died during a game in a saloon. Gambling in the Old West wasn't just a man's game, as plenty of noted women were also professional gamblers. One of the earliest was Doña Maria Gertrudis Barcelo, better known as Doña Tulis. As recounted by History in Santa Fe, she ran a noted gambling den and brothel in Santa Fe, New Mexico during the 1840s and 50s. Then there was Eleanor Dumont, the famous Madame Mustache, who gambled her way across the West starting in the 1840s before committing suicide in Bodie, California in 1879. And Carlotta Tompkins, aka Lottie Dino, took Texas by storm in the mid-1860s and eventually retired comfortably in New Mexico.
She got her nickname after a drunken cowboy proclaimed she should call herself Lotta Dinero, meaning a lot of money in Spanish.
Others included Minnie Smith, also known as Minnie the Gambler, who once horsewhipped a man she caught cheating at cards. Kitty Leroy of Texas arrived in Deadwood, South Dakota with enough money to open the Mint Gambling Saloon. She was shot to death by her 5th husband in 1877. Last but certainly not least was Alice Ivers Duffield Tubbs Huckert, known simply as Poker Alice to her friends. She was a talented faro and poker player across the West. Her career began after she found herself widowed with no support, and she died happily in South Dakota in 1930. Not surprisingly, betting games were frowned upon by proper society and the authorities, as well as the churches back east. By the late 1800s, various cities, towns, and states began enacting a series of laws against gambling. Some games were merely restricted, while others were outlawed entirely. Penalties were initially mild, but increased over time. By 1896, newspapers such as the Seattle Post-Intelligencer were reporting that although the city had ordinances against gambling, it was still going on. And in Montana, a February 1900 issue of the Billings Gazette outright declared gambling must stop on the front page. It was the end of an era filled with colorful players and wild games of chance as the moral majority began looking down on those who dared to gamble. Little by little, states across the West began outlawing gambling with stiff penalties for violators. Nevada was among the first to outlaw gaming altogether in 1909, while the territories of New Mexico and Arizona were told in 1912 that they could only become states if they closed their casinos. As gambling was slowly but surely outlawed across America, laws against it were fine-tuned to prevent any misunderstandings. The California Penal Code described a slew of games, from Faro to Monte to 21 and more, that became illegal to play. Towns in Texas, Oregon, and other places followed suit. A Commission on the Review of the National Policy Towards Gambling report from 1974 notes that even playing cards at home was forbidden in Prescott, Arizona. So what could gamblers do except go underground? Slot machine manufacturers in San Francisco simply rigged their one-armed bandits so that no coins went in, and payouts were made by the house. Other companies revamped their machines to supposedly dispense chewing gum and candy instead of cash. Interestingly enough, certain exceptions were made for churches and state-sponsored lotteries, which could play bingo and other harmless games to make money. But especially with the enactment of nationwide prohibition in 1919, underworld gangsters took over the now illicit gaming industry. Organized crime became big business as speakeasies quietly popped up to replace the once legal casinos. But then the stock market crash of 1929 led to legalizing gambling in places like Nevada, where lucky Las Vegas and other cities remain gambling meccas to this day. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. 8255.